I wanted to talk about a couple of things this morning, realizing that I don't always cover some things in my newsletter articles or various things like that, and not saying that I get up here to preach and I have a captive audience, but I have a captive audience. I wanted to mention one of the great things in our tradition, the ELCA. Across the United States, we have 26 universities and colleges that are a part of a proud legacy of education, which is an important part of who we are as Lutherans because we were founded by a graduate school professor. So education has always been important to us, and in fact, often in religious studies circles, Lutherans tend to punch above their weight in regards to numbers because of this legacy and background. In addition to that, choirs, of course. So that's just who we are. We have a lot of folks that are a part of this congregation that have those kinds of connections. And in fact, we have 2 students currently from our congregation at ELCA schools, and it's fun that both of their families are represented this morning. So St. Olaf and Cal Lutheran currently represented. And I know at the early service, I think we had 4 different colleges represented. And it's something that I think is important for us to remember and say out loud occasionally. It's a cool thing about our tradition. It's maybe not going to be the best fit for everyone, but I just wanted to speak to that out loud because I think if we go a generation or 2 back, we kind of imagine these schools as tiny little Bible schools, and we have this different sense. But when we think of places like Pacific Lutheran University or Gustavus Adolphus or St. Olaf, we're saying those in the same sort of way that we might say Santa Clara University. So these are a proud tradition and something that we should be in mind, because I know I don't write articles about them, and I know I'm sensitive because I went to one, but then I realized it's good for you to hear a little bit more about them. So there you go. Part 1 of the sermon over. Part 2. There's a lot going on in this world. As Pastor Friederike was saying in the announcements this morning, the number of families connected with this congregation that are grieving the loss of a close loved one right now is high. Really, really high. And by right now, I don't mean like over the last month. I mean like in the last 4 days. It is a long list. There's a lot to grieve individually as we think of ourselves as a community of individuals. But then when we read the news, it just makes us ill. All of the things going on in the world. I think of those of you who are a part of this community who are originally from Europe and thinking that Ukraine is maybe not as far away as some of us who were born here think of it as being. There's a lot going on. The Olympics, right? Just finished. And we think of figure skating, right? What a tragic story as we think of this young girl who has had medications provided to her. I'm sure she wasn't perusing the back shelves of some pharmacy somewhere. But I think when we look at this text, when we think about mercy and we think about judgment and we think about all of this, it's easy for us to put on the hat that says, we're the good people. These are the not good people. Those bad people and what they did to that figure skater. But let's not talk about our gymnastics program, right? Let's not talk about that. Or the tension that we think, because it's rarely a clean situation. When we talk to one another, when we experience relationships with tension, when we think of the global news, this idea that there are people who are in the right and people who are in the wrong, when at the end of the day, what it boils down to is that there's often just people. There's often just people. In the old days, we would begin our confession by saying, we confess that we are in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. That we are all in bondage. That shapes the way in which we interact with one another. It shapes the humility that we bring to relationships that are difficult. I remember several years ago now, I was reading an article, and I forget the publication, but it was about a study that had come out by a group of anthropologists who were studying the human hands as compared to other hands of other primates and discussing what the differences were and why that would be the case. And the thesis of this group is that the reason that the human hand is shaped in the way that it is so that it can strike efficiently without damaging the hand. The fact that over millennia, we would develop a more efficient and pain-free way of interacting with our neighbors, right? What are we as human beings capable of? Now, if we look at the Old Testament reading that we have for today, we hear about Joseph and we don't hear about his cool jacket, but we all know about his cool jacket, right? And Joseph has every reason to be angry at his brothers. Now, as someone who has a brother, I feel it at times. But there is this story that we have of his brothers being angry. They chuck him in the well. He gets bought up by slave traders and taken to Egypt. But then he does well, and he becomes prominent in Egyptian society and government. And I suppose we could step back and say, well, how great for him that he was taken into slavery. But I don't think that's the lesson that we're called to draw from it. But the sense of, why is he not punishing his brothers? Where is the anger and the hatred? Where is the sense that you've done me wrong and I'm going to do you wrong because I'm in a position to do it? We don't get that in this story. But do you notice how the brothers expect it? They were afraid because they know how we as human beings interact, that there was likely to be punishment that would land on them. In desperate times with their extended family in the midst of a famine. But there's a phrase in this text that I want you to think on through this week. Joseph brings them close to him, even in their fear, tells them that he will care for them, and then there's a phrase that I'm assuming is smoother in Hebrew, but the oddness of it in English, I think, helps it stick in your ear. He wept on them. He wept on them. Now, what other ways could have been approached? Like this, right? We know lots of stories. In fact, honestly, most stories would go that way. But that's not what Joseph does. And that brings us in some ways to the gospel text that we have for today. This classic story of turning the other cheek. This sense of returning rage with mercy. That's a challenge. Certainly in modern generations, we've said, well, hey, not in every case, not in every situation. I think what I would like to say on that front is that when we talk about love, love sometimes means boundaries. Love sometimes means a sense of needing to speak to one who causes harm. But nonetheless, Jesus is calling us in a society whose first response is often at the individual level, within corporations or governments, one of rage to any insult or slight, particularly these days. That we are called to bring a word of mercy, a word of grace. And I wonder if there isn't something from when I was younger that was probably true for you as we think of siblings, where we would often say to one another, you first, right? You do it first. You first. What does it look like when mercy is that thing that we are doing first? and that we are the ones stepping out and giving mercy where the world expects rage and anger? How do we begin to shape the circles that we are in, our families, our work, our neighborhoods? How does that move from there to places beyond? So, as you hear the readings for today, think of Joseph and his brothers and how he wept on them. And also imagine how Christ calls us, not because it's fun, not because it's what we want to do, but calls on us to show mercy in a world that is just in desperate, desperate need of it. Amen.